There are new reports now that suggest massive waves of liquidity are being pumped into the market, and it's all starting now. We might be seeing the start of QE here. Let's take a look at what's behind these reports. On top of that, we have a second money printer that's really cranking up now. And today he's going to announce, which is really crazy, that Tether, or USDT, is going to launch stablecoins on the Lightning Network. So we have in the future US dollars on the Lightning Network. That's technically true, but not entirely. The Lightning Network is basically being used here to swap dollars back and forth even more efficiently. On one hand, there are people saying, wow, this is ultra crazy for Bitcoin. On the other hand, there are also the other people. The critics are saying, hey, this is really, really critical because here the dollar is getting even stronger. But we definitely see that there's a merging happening between dollars and Bitcoin. And this could also be another opportunity here to further strengthen the US dollar. On the other hand, it's also a price driver for Bitcoin, but we'll get into that in a bit. And in the EU, the ECB is focusing on digital central bank currencies. So what's happening here? That's kind of like a CBDC, but in the USA, it's backed by Bitcoin. And in Germany, they're making CBDCs that aren't backed by Bitcoin. So that's not technically entirely accurate, and we'll dive into that a bit more shortly. Why USDT ultimately also has CBDC-like approaches for why you can also use it as the BDC. Is it a threat to Bitcoin or not? And on top of that, we have the Czech Central Bank, which has now also given the green light. And here they're evaluating whether to include Bitcoin on the balance sheet, and that's pretty huge. But right now, let's take a look at Tether. And as I said, Tether is a stablecoin. That means one USDT is always backed by $1. And Tether has also moved its headquarters here to El Salvador. And today, there was also the Adopting Bitcoin conference here. And now they've made the big announcement. Today, we're announcing that Tether is available for Bitcoin and Lightning. With the security and decentralization of Bitcoin and the speed and scalability of Lightning USDT, we'll bring hundreds of millions of users of volume in the trillions. It all comes down to Bitcoin. And that's crazy. You really have to see this. So here, the Lightning Network, a second layer technology of Bitcoin, is actually being used to send stable coins in the future. And what do we also know? That stable coins, especially USDT, are here. The biggest on-ramp for Bitcoin is, so we have a really intense symbiosis between USDT and Bitcoin. That means a lot of investors aren't going into Bitcoin directly with dollars, but they're going through dollars into stable coins. And from stable coins, you then go into Bitcoin. And what if these stable coins merge here? With that, the Lightning Network makes it even easier, better, and more efficient to send stable coins. So on one hand, this is very, very bullish for the Bitcoin price because there's potentially going to be even more inflow into Bitcoin. On the other hand, we see that even more usage is coming to Bitcoin because Bitcoin is also a settlement layer. Some bigger players are already using this, or theoretically, central banks could use it too. For example, you want to send some dollars to China. You convert the dollars into Bitcoin, into Lightning Bitcoin, and then send the Lightning Bitcoin over. China has almost no transaction fees. It happens instantly, sending it all to China. In China, you convert the Lightning Bitcoin back into. The Chinese currency has been super efficient through the Lightning Network here. Sent money to China. And I can't explain it to you technically in detail, how this is happening here with Tether. But it will work out pretty similarly here, that you can basically use Bitcoin just as a settlement, using the network. So this brings more traction to Bitcoin. And here Ted already mentioned in the end, nothing can really compete with Bitcoin in the long run. Because why would you want to rely on a settlement network now? That in the end, maybe in 2, 10, or 5 years, it won't even exist anymore. And then, of course, you want to rely on the best technology. And that's crazy because they've banned CBDCs in the US. This is really, really important. A lot of people say that it's basically completely irrelevant when they ban the CBDCs here. Because in the end, it just means that the US won't take the approach that Europe is taking, that Europe is doing. This means that Europe has a digital euro, a digital central bank currency, and that's all well and good. But it's probably not going to work anyway because people just aren't into it, because it's just old school technology. And the Americans, they're taking it now. Space technology, they use Tether in combination with Bitcoin. And you also need to know that Tether USDT, even though it's running over the Lightning Network, is not uncensorable money. It can be censored. That can happen too. Tendentially, it can be programmed, but that can also be taken away in some way. There are actually blacklists too. And so on, there are actually blacklists for Tether, where people are on it, where the coins are basically made invalid. And then there are a lot of voices that, for example, say, okay, now the CBDCs aren't coming from the public sector, but they're coming from the private sector. So basically, they're introducing CBDCs under the radar. but they're disguising it as Tether, USDT. And the Bitcoin community is cheering for all of this because it's obviously driving the Bitcoin price up. But it's proud to see that on one hand, there's light here, a rising Bitcoin price, but on the other hand, there is also a shadow and certainly a danger. And that's ultimately the big question. Is Tether really a nice positive for Bitcoin? A nice positive for Bitcoin because on one hand, there's now basically demand for Bitcoin. It strengthens Bitcoin because it's obviously increasing the usage of Bitcoin, especially when it runs over the Lightning Network. On the next page, it brings liquidity to Bitcoin. On the next page, Tether holds large amounts of Bitcoin. So Tether is basically a massive money printing machine. And this excess money is also partially allocated to Bitcoin. That means there are big Bitcoin buyers. That means it's driving the price up. On the other hand, a lot of people accuse Tether of being bad actors because they could obviously censor here. And theoretically, Tether could also be taken over here from the USA. And then pressure could be applied to Tether. Certain things, to carry out embargo lists or to cancel people and a lot more. The CEO of Tether says here, Bitcoin is the safest network in the world. Building on Bitcoin makes sense, and a lot of people will probably realize that in the future. It doesn't make any sense to build any infrastructures on some shitcoins. Instead, it only makes sense to do it on the safest network. But it's probably here it says in another statement that was made during the announcement. But it's probably should be the backbone for the world's currencies. Bitcoin is becoming a global routing currency and a global asset. We want to Bitcoinize the dollar by bringing stablecoins to Bitcoin. So that's a really massive statement. That means additionally, if every dollar is Bitcoinized, does that mean the dollar will be strengthened again? Because Tether is buying government bonds. Then the dollar gets strengthened. The dollar is reaching areas where it might not otherwise be available. That means the dollar is kind of hanging on here. Tether. And Tether is once again tied to Bitcoin. That means Bitcoin could even lead to that the dollar continues to maintain its value. And on top of that, Donald Trump is maybe planning a Bitcoin reserve. That means on multiple levels, the dollar is now being merged with Bitcoin. That's a really, really interesting story that's currently happening here. And I don't have any assessment here, whether that's good or bad. I'm just observing, that's all. Of course, it's good for the price. But I also see the criticisms here, that Tether isn't really a freedom currency, but rather Tether here, of course. It's also a potentially censorable currency. But its CEO also adds another point. So the CEO of Tether, when they tokenize assets worth trillions of dollars, is Bitcoin the only place where you can do that? That's basically referring back to that you can tell your stories here, including your tokenization stories, and that can be commented on positively or negatively. But at least you don't do that on some shitcoin layer, but that you do it on the safest network in the world. And that's just it here, Bitcoin. And then there were also reports like this. So on one hand, we have the money printers that are basically starting through Tether. So Tether is obviously minting new USDT here. Here, new digital dollars are basically being created. And then we also have the fiat side. And here was Jerome Powell. He said that quantitative tightening is going to be eased a bit. So that means they're sucking less liquidity out of the market now. And that obviously has a positive effect on it. Hey, support. But now Marty is actually writing here, Marty in printer, and that caused quite a stir. And it always causes a stir when such reports come out. He's saying here, what you're not being told is this. The Treasury is printing money like crazy. Only today they announced that in February, as part of an auction by the Treasury, $241 billion of new money will be printed. Quantitative easing has begun. And Jerome, will they only tell you when it's too late to get in deep, by crypto, Bitcoin, and so on? And then he says, don't just believe me, just look it up here. Now there's a link to the source and all where you can check this out. And he's basically claiming that quantitative easing is already starting here, because the Treasury is basically holding an auction here, and then new money is supposed to be put into circulation. And you keep seeing that report every now and then. Also last year, the year before, I actually fell for that once. I also thought that, hey, they're starting to print money here, but you really have to make a distinction here in the U.S. between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank. Someone's also commenting below, that's wrong. The Fed, not the Treasury, prints money. The Treasury raises money by issuing financial bonds, such as through an auction. So it borrows money from investors, foreign governments, and so on. If the Fed buys large amounts of these bonds, you might be able to call it QE here. But until then, it's just regular government debt. So basically, the Treasury is issuing debt securities. And the securities, the Federal Reserve isn't buying those either. They're obviously being sold on the open market. And then you can't really call this QE. Illegal state financing or not. Illegal. It's legal if you do it through a shadow bank or something like that. But QE just means that liquidity is being pumped into the market, because basically no one is buying government bonds anymore. So when the Treasury issues government bonds here, no one wants to buy them open market. Then the Federal Reserve steps in. They buy that crap, and then the money supply goes up. And yes, the interest rate is also manipulated at the long end. At the short end, you manipulate it all the time anyway. Through the central bank, the interest rate at the long end is manipulated. And that's the scenario that a lot of people are still expecting in 2025. And if not in 2025, then definitely by 2026. We have seen this very clearly during the Corona period. There were various quantitative easing programs that pumped massive liquidity into the market, not just through low interest rates, but also through the Fed's purchases of government bonds. I mean, that's true again because people were posting stuff about it. Since January, the money supply has been on the rise again. You can just see the statistics here, like how the M2 money supply is pumping up here. This is obviously important for Bitcoin because Bitcoin has an 82% correlation with the M2 money supply. That means as the M2 money supply goes up, Bitcoin goes up too. You can also see it here in the statistics that we're already experiencing the flippening. So the money supply is starting to rise a bit again, even if we don't have the crazy ones yet. See money printing machines, and even if interest rates are still somewhat high. So for the high interest rates, the Bitcoin price is actually still looking pretty good. And here someone even writes, if this rapid increase in the global M2 volume continues until February or March, the Bitcoin price is definitely set to skyrocket. So basically, if the trend doesn't continue. But it's probably 1% increase in the M2 volume, the Bitcoin price goes up by 8.95%. If M2 returns to the high from November, that corresponds to a Bitcoin price increase of about 27%. And here you really have to be careful. It's being suggested here. Okay, there's a correlation between the M2 money supply and the Bitcoin price. That means when the M2 money supply goes up, the Bitcoin price goes up. And then it's mentioned here, okay, now when the money supply goes up by 1%, then Bitcoin goes up 8%. And when the money supply hits this and that point, for example, if it goes up by 3%, then Bitcoin goes up by 27%. And here you have to be careful. You can do calculations and it's done over and over again. But you can't just derive a mathematical formula like that. Like, okay, the money supply goes up by 1%, and so Bitcoin has to go up by 10%. We have also seen some situations where the money supply has gone up and Bitcoin has dropped. We've seen situations where the money supply has gone down and Bitcoin has gone up. So yes, there is a correlation, but you can't make a causation out of it. And you can't say, okay, every time the money supply goes up, Bitcoin goes up. Sometimes there are lag effects where it just takes longer until Bitcoin goes up. And sometimes the M2 money supply is ahead of the Bitcoin price, and sometimes the M2 money supply is behind the Bitcoin price. You really have to pay close attention here. What you can only hold on to, that you have the general long-term trend, increasing. Money supply boosts Bitcoin price. And then we actually have the Czech National Bank here. I also said yesterday, just 24 hours left until something big could happen here. We actually have confirmation here. So the Czech National Bank has decided today to look into expanding investments into other asset classes, including Bitcoin. Now we just have to wait and see if the Czech National Bank actually buys Bitcoin. So will there be an announcement the day before that this could possibly happen? Now we basically have confirmation that the Bitcoin allocation is being reviewed. So we basically have exactly the same thing happening here as in the U.S. But we also have the disappointment here, just like in the US, where everyone thought, okay, now Bitcoin is being bought, but then Bitcoin wouldn't actually be bought. But it was just said, okay, we're checking to see if we can do this. And here, in the end, Christine Lagarde also said that one central banker from the Czech Republic must be a massive Bitcoin bull. Or that's not how she said it. But whether you guys in Europe are really into that, it seems like this Czech guy at the central bank is really into Bitcoin. If you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'm putting a link down below for you. 21 Bitcoin, how you can easily, safely, and simply buy Bitcoin. I'm here in the jail cell in El Salvador. I'm signing off. See you later. Peace out.